historical narrative presented in this documentary emphasizes the interconnectedness of North African cultures and civilizations with the development of modernity, challenging the Eurocentric view that often overlooks this relationality. It highlights figures like Ibn Battuta, whose extensive travels spanned regions from West Africa to China, showcasing the fluidity of social identity and cultural exchange in pre-colonial times. This fluidity allowed individuals to engage in trade, knowledge, production, and various exchanges to negotiate multiple cultural identities simultaneously. The work criticizes the rigid fixation of identities imposed by Western epistemologies, contrasting it with the normative mobile classificatory labels found in non-Western traditions. It points out how Western thought historically suppressed the interrelatedness of cultures beyond its own borders, perpetuating a narrative of unilinear evolutionary progress that marginalized African and non-Western histories. The historical narrative presented in this documentary explores the role of North Africa and the Middle East in shaping early Western epistemology and the global meaning of blackness. It highlights how during the Reconquista, North Africa was perceived as a primary form of racial otherness in contrast to Proto-European Christian whiteness. This perception of otherness persisted into modernity and influenced the rise of Europe both as a concept and an entity. The violent disruptions caused by the Iberian Reconquista in the late 15th century played a crucial role in reshaping societal norms in North Africa and wider African Old World civilizations. This disruption, coupled with the emergence of monocultural theocentric epistemologies and modern biocentric racial categories, contributed to the rise of Europe and the proliferation of modern racism. Mediterranean and Afro-Asian societal concepts were suppressed, appropriated, and transformed into the colonial societies of Western Europe. These concepts were extended into transatlantic and global forms of racism, particularly in plantation-based racial chattel slavery and other extractive capitalist relations. Recent scholarship has shed light on the origin of modern concepts of race, pointing to the Iberian Reconquista and the concurrent conquest of the New World as pivotal moments. Islamic Iberia and North Africa served as cultural confluence between the Mediterranean and Africa, with ties to various Old World civilizations. Historical documents from Jewish Mediterranean communities reveal the existence of categories of blackness in cultural, theological, and juridical thinking prior to the Atlantic Passage. However, during this period, blackness did not consistently carry negative connotations, and its meaning were fluid and variable. Pre-Western and non-Western epistemic categories viewed identities as mobile and shifting rather than fixed. Terms like Moor in North Africa and Zanj in East Africa were not uniformly associated with positive and negative attributes, and were not strictly tied to specific geographic locations. These categories often overlapped across the vast expanse of African continent, Southern Asia, and the Indian Ocean. It's crucial to strip away later anti-black interpretations from terms associated with black and African peoples and culture, many of which emerged in the late 19th and 20th centuries. These interpretations, often colonial in nature, have been projected back into history by modern societies, presenting themselves as normative. For instance, while late modernity commonly refers to the Judeo-Christian tradition, historically, the Judeo-Islamic tradition held greater prominence across both space and time. This tradition developed largely in an African context, which has been contrasted with Western society's civilization version. During the Kingdom of Al-Andalus, societies spanning southern Europe, the Mediterranean, and North Africa formed a fluctuating grid of hierarchical relational racial points, with a non-hierarchical orientation that leaned towards Africa and blackness. However, with the Reconquista and the rise of European empires, identities became increasingly ordered into a hierarchy of race and class, with southern regions disadvantaged. Imperial powers like Spain, Portugal, and later Holland claimed primacy, while identities in southern Europe and beyond were racialized by their northern European counterparts. North Africa, designed as separate from the rest of Africa, reflected a border of otherness influenced by a colonial conception of the Middle East and racial hierarchies. The term North Africa itself carries colonial, racial, and geographic origins, making its contemporary usage provincial and subject to deconstruction. European feudalism waned, giving way to a shift in the concept of purity of blood, which evolved into modern racial categories. This shift marked the beginnings of a grid of ethno-racial coordinates, with blackness and relational non-whiteness positioned specifically at one end. The Reconquista saw the imposition of a monocultural hierarchy for the first time, solidifying fixed relational identifications. The Holy Inquisition targeted various groups as enemies, including Jews, Muslims, Moors, women, witches, infidels, heretics, and left-handed individuals. These groups became the original authors of modernity, differentiated through existing terminologies of dehumanization and geopolitical tensions. Under the Inquisition, individuals could be labeled as agents of Satan along multiple axes of difference simultaneously. The fluid categorization of the other signified their authority and non-humanity, posing a threat to the new order. The West's foundation under a Christian theological epistemology led to the establishment of hierarchical narratives such as the Great Chain of Being and the Cause of Harm. These narratives informed the first 300 years of modern Western epistemology and continue to influence global dynamics. Resistance to this system of difference has been widespread, resulting in literal and figurative maroon spaces and internal destabilizations. Iberian city-states displaced Al-Andalus from southern Europe, but the ancient African civilization to which it was connected persisted and flourished despite northern neighbors' aggression. The worldwide network of nations and civilizations, including Northern Africa, remained largely intact until the late 19th and early 20th centuries, experiencing colonial ruptures of varying degrees. While the Mediterranean, Atlantic, and American worlds underwent significant colonial disruptions in the late 15th and 16th centuries, much of Africa and Asia experienced more episodic or indirect colonial impacts for the first 300 years of modernity. Full colonial control began to take hold in the Middle East, East and Central Africa, and the Indian Ocean, Asian worlds in the past century or two. Northern Africa served as a confluence zone between these patterns, with elements of both observed, though generally aligning more with the latter pattern. However, Algeria presents a notable exception to this trend. Various civilizations across Northern Africa, Southwest Asia, and East Africa resisted immersion into capitalist world economies. It's important not to retroactively impose European outcomes on the early colonial period, as colonial incursions rarely resulted in total hegemonic reorganization until the past 1 or 2 centuries in most regions of the Old World. The Spanish and Portuguese empires engaged in primitive accumulation through the theft and expropriation of people, labor, and resources, particularly in the Americas and Africa. The Spanish were more successful in disrupting and colonizing core states in the New World compared to the Portuguese in Africa and the Indian Ocean. The Dutch, along with other European city-states and empires, codified slavery and plantation capitalism as core components of the international capitalist economy. They established the first stock exchange and modern banking practices. Africanity and blackness became consolidated as the basis of racial chattel slave status in Dutch and other imperial realms. During the British and French imperial periods, the transatlantic chattel slave system reached its extremes. Despite partial abolition in the Atlantic, chattel slavery expanded under European proxies into eastern and some northern parts of Africa. The scramble for Africa in the late 19th century laid the groundwork for colonization at the turn of the century, followed by further scrambles for Southwest Asia and the rest of Asia. Key milestones include significant conferences like the 1955 Afro-Asian Conference in Bandung, Indonesia, and the emergence of the Non-Aligned Movement in the 1970s, representing concerted efforts against colonial domination. North Africa emerges as a pivotal theater for anti-colonial resistance, hosting movements such as the Black Panther Party and the Palestine Liberation Organization, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. The Battle of Algiers in Algeria became emblematic of resistance against French colonialism and its global ramifications. The narrative also addresses the colonial distortion of African history and identity, highlighting how Africa was marginalized and denied its rightful place in world history. Territories were redefined, and African identities were suppressed to justify colonial control. Colonial powers employed strategies like divide and rule and established uneven administrative structures to maintain dominance. Ethno-racial hierarchies were constructed or exacerbated, affecting societies in North Africa and nearby regions. Groups like Berbers, Tuareg, and Bedouin were racially marginalized despite their rich cultural heritage. Institutionalized anti-blackness persists, with documented cases in Libya and Egypt, where repression against Nubians, Sudanese, and Bedouins is evident. Similar dynamics are observed in Morocco's relationship with Western Sahara. Across the region, there are evident manifestations of racialized behavior towards those perceived to be from the South, whether within national borders or in relations with neighboring regions like the Sahara, West and Southern Africa. Factors such as phenotype, regional perception, language, and culture significantly shaped these hierarchies, making North-South disparities tangible rather than abstract concepts. In each country, both citizens and non-citizens experience varying degrees of racialization, often influenced by perceptions from those situated to the north. This racialization persists despite centuries of political economic inequality and epistemic colonization. Contemporary issues such as forced migrations, statelessness, and refugee crises further exacerbate racial tensions, with Western epistemology often employing dehumanizing language like illegal aliens or terrorists to describe marginalized populations. Even after 500 years, race and anti-blackness continue to play central roles in shaping social dynamics, demonstrating remarkable consistency despite ongoing variations, rearticulations, and resistances. These upheavals challenge the nation-state structure and raise questions about the efficacy and legitimacy of Western concepts. Population transfers, coupled with extreme inequality and impoverishment, highlight the significance of these regions as border zones and primary sites for identity formation within the Western order. The Judeo-Islamic tradition in the region, despite its historical importance, remains suppressed within Western epistemology, which predominantly favors Judeo-Christian narratives. Ethnic codification of alterity continues to shape Western constructions of self and otherness, as evidenced by shifts in racial categorization over the past century. Jewish populations in the United States and the West were largely accorded white status after the Holocaust, while Arab, Syrian, Berber, North Africa, and Levantine immigrant populations continue to face racism and discrimination. Since the 1970s, particularly amidst the Israel-Palestine conflict and heightened anti-Western sentiment following events like the September 11 attacks, Arabs and North Africans have increasingly been racialized and dehumanized within the global system. Western epistemology rooted in oppositional categories like civilization and savagery continues to draw from Africa, Arab and Islamic alterity to construct notions of self and otherness. While the fixed nature of modern identity categories is acknowledged, there is recognition of fluidity within these structures, which remains a focal point of contestation and negotiation. Efforts to simply invert these systems are deemed insufficient, as articulated by Fanon. Western demagogues often perpetuate a colonial civilizational model that pits the West against the rest of humanity, perpetuating false dichotomies and hegemonic power structures. Similar dynamics are observed within internally colonized populations of the Western nations. The concept of the era of man, wherein certain individuals designate themselves as superior and ruler over others and nature, is critiqued. Decolonizing historical narratives and epistemologies is proposed as a means to move towards a new era, where such dichotomies lose relevance, allowing for a more inclusive understanding of humanity.